Hey guys, DontCallTechSupport here, and today we're looking at the Aorus RTX 2060 Super by Gigabyte. This turned out to be a lot of data, so in the comments you will find some timestamps. In the summary, the card will receive a grade in the following categories: noise, temperature, and build quality. There's two features that made me choose this model for testing. First is the 7 total display outputs, but be aware though that you cannot use them all at once. So you can either choose to use 3 display ports and 1 HDMI, or 3 HDMI and 1 DisplayPort in addition to the Virtual Link USB-C port. The other features is the RGB lighting. Now I know not everyone is interested in this, but the RGB lighting on this card looks really good. Using the RGB Fusion 2.0 software, you can choose from loads of different modes and colors, and they all look great. However, there is no doubt that this card looks best being vertical mounted, where you can see the lighting on the fans. The card features 3 100mm fans, each with 1 fan blade with an LED. The 2 outer fans overlap the center fan, so this is done to shorten the length of the card. And the center fan also spins in the opposite direction to the outer fans, which is supposed to reduce turbulence and increase cooling performance. The fan shroud is plastic with a backlit Aorus logo on top of the card, as well as on the center fan. In addition, the card also has a fan indicator indicating if the fans are running or not, which may be redundant since the fans light up themselves when running. The backplate is metal and features no RGB lighting, just an Aorus logo in dark gray. The backplate is the same as on the higher end models, which explains the cutout in the corner for the NVLink connector, which is not present on this model. Between the backplate and the PCB there are several thermal pads, which makes the backplate act like a heat spreader. The heatsink features 5 heat pipes with direct contact to the GPU die, and the dimensions of the card are 290mm long, 134mm tall, and 59.9mm thick, and it weighs in at 1.25 kilograms. So this model uses one 6-pin and one 8-pin power connector, and Gigabyte recommends a 550 watt power supply or greater. Core clock is 1845 MHz and memory is running at 14 gigabits per second. But when testing, the core clock actually settled on 1965 MHz, thanks to GPU boost. And for those of you looking to overclock, you can move the power limiter on this card to 133%. At the time of testing, this card can be had for $450. Now we got quite a bit of data to go through, so let's start off with temperature, noise, and power consumption when running the Firestrike Extreme stress test. All numbers are from an open-air test bench. So temperature on the load was 48 degrees Celsius over ambient, and this would result in a temperature of 70 degrees Celsius in a 22-degree room. Now, judging from all my testing with this card, Gigabyte seems to have set a target temperature of 70 degrees. When idle, the temperature is 27 degrees Celsius over ambient, resulting in a temperature of 49 degrees Celsius in a 22-degree room. On to noise next. Noise is measured with the microphone 30 centimeters away from the fans on the card in an open-air test bench. So the Aorus RTX 2060 Super did good here. Under load, the noise level was 43 dBA, and at idle, the card itself makes no noise at all due to the fan stop feature. Now let's bring up fan speed. Under load, the fan speed remained pretty stable at 1800 RPM, and seen in relation to the noise level, these are pretty quiet fans. So onto power consumption when running a Firestrike stress test. We'll get to power consumption when gaming after the gaming benchmarks, but when running Firestrike, the Aorus 2060 Super pulled 298 watts from the Corsair RM1000I's 12-volt rail. This is 20 watt less than the OC BIOS on the PowerColor Redragon RX 5700 XT, and 32 watts less than the 2070 Super. Starting off with some synthetic benchmarks, so graphics score in Firestrike, the Aorus 2060 Super scored 23,639 points, coming in 6% behind the 2070 Super and 12% behind the RX 5700 XT. When overclocked, it is just behind the RTX 2070 Super. In Firestrike Extreme, the RTX 2060 Super scored 11,334 points. When overclocked, this increases by 6% to 11,988 points, still short of the 2070 Super and RX 5700 XT. In Firestrike Ultra, the 2060 Super scored 5,603 points when stock and 5,916 points when overclocked, slightly ahead of the 2070 Super but still short of the 5700 XT. In Time Spy, the 2060 Super scored 9,376 points, and with that it is 7% ahead of the 5700 XT, but 8% behind the 2070 Super. Once overclocked, the 2060 Super scored 10,023 points and is 13% ahead of the 5700 XT and just slightly behind the stock 2070 Super. Now let's see how it compares to a 1070, 2070 Super and Power Color RX 5700 XT Red Dragon in gaming. We start off with Battlefield 5, so in 1080p the 2070 Super did 116.3 frames per second on average. Now this is 4% behind the 2070 Super and 22% behind the RX 5700 XT Red Dragon. If we move to 1440p, the 2070 Super is now doing 84.4 frames per second on average, and this is again 4% behind the 2070 Super and 23% behind the 5700 XT. In 4K, we're down to 49.6 frames per second on average with the 2060 Super. Now the 2070 Super is 3% ahead and the 5700 XT Red Dragon is 15% ahead of the 2060 Super. Next up is Devil May Cry 5, so at 1080p the 2060 Super did 162.8 frames per second on average. The 5700 XT Red Dragon was 3% ahead of the 2060 Super, and the 2070 Super had a 10% lead over its smaller sibling. In 1440p the 2060 Super did 106.3 frames per second on average. The 5700 XT is now 5% faster at this resolution, and the 2070 Super is 11% ahead for the average FPS. In 4K, the 2060 Super fell slightly short of 60 frames per second at 56.3 frames per second on average, being 12% behind the 2070 Super and matching the 5700 XT. Now let's look at Division 2. So starting off at 1080p, the 2060 Super did 98.4 frames per second on average, 17% behind the 2070 Super, but only 2% behind the 5700 XT. In 1440p, the RTX 2060 Super averaged 65.6 frames per second, a mere 2% behind the 5700 XT, while the 2070 Super had a larger lead of 16%. If we move to 4K, the 2070 Super is now down to 35 frames per second on average and is 2% ahead of the 5700 XT, but 15% behind the 2070 Super. Next up is Fortnite, and at 1080p the RTX 2060 Super did 146.3 frames per second on average, 8% ahead of the RX 5700 XT, which came in at 134.3 frames per second on average, and the 2070 Super is 6% faster than the 2060 Super. At 1440p, things changed drastically, and it's almost as if I don't believe these numbers, but here they are. So the 2060 Super now did 88 frames per second on average, going from an 8% lead over the 5700 XT to trailing the 5700 XT by 11%, and the 2070 Super by 12%. At 4K, the 2060 Super is now down to 44.2 frames per second on average, being 12% behind the 2070 Super and 5700 XT. Forza Horizon 4 is up next, and at 1080p, the 2060 Super did 137.5 frames per second on average, and the 5700 XT is 12% ahead of the 2060 Super, and the 2070 Super is 14% ahead at 1080p. At 1440p, the 2060 Super did 109.3 frames per second on average, and the RX 5700 XT is now ahead by 14%, and the 2070 Super is slightly further ahead at 16%. In 4K, the 2060 Super managed 72.1 frames per second on average, a good result, but 10% behind the 5700 XT and 16% behind the 2070 Super. Next game we're looking at is Gears of War 5. So in Gears of War 5 at 1080p, the 2060 Super did 97.7 frames per second on average, 12% behind the 5700 XT and 9% behind the 2070 Super. In 1440p, the 2060 Super did 64.3 frames per second on average, coming in 11% behind the 5700 XT and 2070 Super. Moving up to 4K, we're now down to 38.4 frames per second on average, and this result is only 2% behind the 5700 XT and 6% behind the 2070 Super. Next is Ghost Recon Wildlands, despite the fact that Breakpoint is now out. So at 1080p, the 2060 Super mustered 65 frames per second on average, and the 5700 XT is 3% ahead here, and the 2070 Super is 8% ahead of the 2060 Super. In 1440p, the 2060 Super did 50.7 frames per second on average, coming in 11% behind the 5700 XT and 9% behind the 2070 Super. There's no 4K testing on this title, so let's just move on to Rainbow Six Siege. At 1080p, the 2060 Super did 185.9 frames per second on average, coming in 4% behind the 5700 XT and 7% behind the 2070 Super. So in editing, it turns out I forgot to mention the 1440p numbers, so here they are. At 1440p, the 2060 Super did 111.1 frames per second on average, which is 6% behind the 5700 XT and 14% behind the 2070 Super. At 4K, the 2060 Super did just over 60 frames per second at 60.1 frames per second on average, this time being 8% ahead of the 5700 XT, which doesn't do very well at 4K. Next game is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and at 1080p, the 2060 Super did 96.6 frames per second on average, 3% behind the 5700 XT and 10% behind the 2070 Super. At 1440p, the 2060 Super did 64.9 frames per second on average, coming in 5% behind the Red Dragon 5700 XT and 12% behind the 2070 Super. Moving things up to 4K, and the 2060 Super delivered 34.5 frames per second on average, essentially matching the 5700 XT but still being 11% shy of the 2070 Super. The Witcher 3 is the last game we're testing, and here the 2060 Super did 126.8 frames per second on average at 1080p, which is 11% ahead of the 5700 XT but 8% behind the 2070 Super. Moving up to 1440p, and the 2060 Super now did 84.5 frames per second on average, and the lead over the 5700 XT is now down to 2%, and the 2070 Super is 6% ahead of the 2060 Super. At 4K, we're down to 45.8 frames per second on average, a 4% lead over the 5700 XT, but 11% behind the 2070 Super. New for this review is ray tracing performance. Now we're looking at ray tracing performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Battlefield 5 and Control, and we're not using DLSS for this test. Starting off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we're using the Ultra Ray Tracing preset and Highest Graphics preset. I'm not using the built-in benchmark for this test, but rather a run in the woods. The 2060 Super did 56.4 frames per second on average at 1080p, coming in 11% behind the 2070 Super at 62.7 frames per second on average. Increasing the resolution to 1440p, and the 2060 Super is now down to 36 frames per second on average, coming in 12% behind the 2070 Super. At 4K, 2060 Super averaged 18.2 frames per second on average, which was 13% behind the 2070 Super at 20.6 frames per second on average. Moving on to Control, so we're using the High Graphics preset, and I think it is High Ray Tracing preset. At 1080p, the 2060 Super comes in at 53 frames per second on average, which is 10% behind the 2070 Super at 58.1 frames per second on average, increasing the resolution to 1440p, and the 2070 Super is now down to 33.4 frames per second on average, which is 9% behind the 2070 Super. At 4K, we're looking at 16.2 frames per second on average, and a completely unplayable experience. Battlefield 5 is next, and here the 2060 Super did 54.2 frames per second on average, 11% behind the 2070 Super, which did an even 60 frames per second. At 1440p, the 2060 Super managed 35.8 frames per second on average, 12% behind the 2070 Super. And looking at the 4K result is just depressing. Now let's look at some overclocking numbers. I was able to overclock the core by 80 MHz, keeping the core clock around 2045 MHz. For the memory, I could add 900 MHz, bringing the total bandwidth to 15.8 gigabits per second, if I'm not mistaken. So, starting off with Gears of War 5 at 1440p, the overclock increases performance by 7%, going from 64.3 frames per second to 69 frames per second on average, and we're still 9% behind the 5700 XT and 2070 Super. Now let's look at how the overclock fares in Rainbow Six Siege at 1440p. The overclock had us going from 111.1 frames per second to 123.7 frames per second on average, an increase of 11%. This causes the 2060 Super to surpass the 5700 XT, leading it by 5%, but of course overclocking the 5700 XT brings it back in front. The overclocked 2060 Super is now just 3% behind the 2070 Super. Lastly, we check performance in Witcher 3, so here the overclock increased performance by 7%, going from 84.5 frames per second on average to 90.3 frames per second on average, and it is now matching the stock 2070 Super, and it's 9% ahead of the 5700 XT. Now looking at power consumption in The Witcher 3 at 1440p, total system power draw from the PSU was 346 watts with the 2060 Super at stock, 22 watts more than the Red Dragon 5700 XT and 17 watts less than the 2070 Super. Overclocking increases power consumption by 41 watts to 387 watts, surpassing the 2070 Super but staying behind the 5700 XT with plus 50% power limit. Now let's look at watts per FPS in The Witcher 3. At stock, the Aorus RTX 2060 Super requires 4.09 watts per FPS, slightly more than the Zotac 2070 Super. When overclocked, this increases to 4.29 watts per FPS, bringing it closer to the Red Dragon overclocked with a plus 20% power limit. Now we'll look at relative performance in 1440p across the 10 games tested. So for relative performance, we use the Aorus 2060 Super as a baseline. The 5700 XT is on average 9% faster in the 10 games tested at 1440p, while the 2070 Super is 12% faster on average at 1440p. For price to performance, we're using the price of $450 and divide that by the 10 game average at 1440p. So for the Aorus 2060 Super, you're paying $5.43 per FPS, slightly more than the 2070 Super at $499, and quite a bit more than the 5700 XT Red Dragon. So time to grade the card. When it comes to temperature, this card is good, and as a result it gets an A. The noise level is also good at 43 dBA, which results in a B. Build quality feels good, and it crucially has a metal backplate. The bar that crosses the fans feels a bit flimsy, and overall I'll give it a C in build quality. The card has a good cooling solution and excellent RGB lighting, if that's something you care about. I do have one wish though, so I wish the build quality was a bit higher. It's not bad, but I would have preferred that the bars going across the front of the fans was in metal or reinforced by metal. It's little things, but it's the little things that increases the overall feel when it comes to build quality. So, do I recommend this card? Yes, this card is recommended if you're set on a RTX 2060 Super. In short, the Aorus 2060 Super is a decent card, the 5700 XT is better value, and the 2070 Super is faster and more expensive. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and farewell.